Something changed in Michigan on August 4th that Democrats cannot afford to ignore. A Senate race that was supposed to be a fight over whether Republicans could break through in Michigan has now become something much bigger, a test of what the Democratic Party actually wants to be. Abdul El-Sayed defeated establishment-backed Democrat Haley Stevens in the Democratic primary, and now he faces Republican Mike Rogers in a general election that, according to the latest polling averages, is basically a dead heat. But here's where this gets interesting. The story isn't simply that a progressive Democrat won a primary. The real story is how the Democratic coalition is changing, who El-Sayed managed to mobilize, which voters he struggled to reach, and whether that coalition can survive a statewide general election. Because Michigan isn't New York. It's one of the states where Democrats need working-class voters, suburban voters, Black voters, Arab American voters, young voters, and independents to come together. And now all of those groups are going to be tested. So today, we're breaking down what actually happened in Michigan, why the Democratic primary became such a major ideological battle, what the polling is telling us now, and why this race could become one of the most closely watched Senate contests of 2026. And there's one question hanging over everything. Did Democrats just nominate the candidate who can rebuild their coalition, or the candidate who exposes how divided that coalition has become? The primary was never just about one candidate. To understand why this race matters, you have to go back to the Democratic primary. The central contest was between Abdul El-Sayed and Representative Haley Stevens. Stevens represented the more traditional Democratic establishment. El-Sayed represented the party's progressive and populist wing. And this wasn't simply a personality contest. The two candidates represented very different ideas about where Democrats should go next. Stevens had support from major Democratic figures and establishment networks. El-Sayed built his campaign around a more confrontational message, particularly on economic issues and U.S. policy toward Israel. That divide became one of the defining features of the race. And for a while, the race looked much closer than the final polling suggested. In mid-July, one Detroit area poll had Stevens leading El-Sayed 48% to 41%. That poll also showed Stevens performing particularly well among Black voters, non-college voters, and Detroit area voters. El-Sayed, meanwhile, performed better among college-educated voters and voters identifying as Democratic Socialists. That distinction matters because it gave us an early preview of the question that would eventually dominate the entire race. Can a candidate powered by progressive enthusiasm expand that coalition beyond the voters who are already enthusiastic about him? That is a very different question from simply winning a primary. And it is the question that now follows El-Sayed into November. Then the primary flipped the script. As Election Day approached, the numbers began moving. By late July, several polls had El-Sayed ahead. One Emerson poll had him at 54%, compared with Stevens at 39%. Another Mitchell Research poll showed El-Sayed ahead 52% to 38%. The final polling average also had El-Sayed leading Stevens going into the primary. And on August 4th, he delivered the result. El-Sayed defeated Stevens and became the Democratic nominee. But the significance wasn't just that an establishment-backed candidate lost. It was that the Democratic primary had effectively answered one question. The progressive wing had enough strength to take control of the nomination. That is politically important. Because parties don't just choose candidates. Primaries reveal which voters are most motivated. And in Michigan, El-Sayed's coalition proved capable of overcoming the institutional advantages behind Stevens. The Washington Post reported that El-Sayed overcame a more than 8-to-1 spending disadvantage against Stevens. That's a remarkable political story by itself. But winning the primary was only step one. Because the electorate that chooses a Democratic nominee is not the same electorate that chooses a U.S. senator in November. And that's where the race gets much more complicated. The numbers after the primary tell a different story. Immediately after the primary, the question changed. Nobody was asking anymore, can El Sayed win the Democratic nomination? He already had. Now the question became, can he win Michigan? And the early general election numbers show just how competitive this is. The latest polling average has El Sayed and Republican Mike Rogers separated by roughly a point. 272 wins current average has El Sayed at about 45.8% and Rogers at 45.0%. That is not a comfortable Democratic lead. It is not a comfortable Republican lead either. It's a toss-up. And individual polls tell the same story. An August 20 AARP poll showed El Sayed at 48% and Rogers at 47%. But an earlier Fox News poll had Rogers ahead 51% to 47%. Another poll had El Sayed leading by 7 points. So the lesson isn't that one candidate has suddenly taken control. The lesson is that the race is extremely fluid, and that makes the next few months incredibly important, because voters are still learning about the two candidates. The campaigns still have time to define each other, and undecided voters still have enormous influence over the final result. Why Michigan is such a difficult state to win. Here's the part that gets overlooked when national political arguments take over. Michigan doesn't vote as one giant ideological bloc. It is a coalition state. Democrats need strong turnout in Detroit. They need support from black voters. They need to compete in the suburbs. They need working-class voters outside the major urban centers. They need young voters. And depending on the race, Arab American voters can be enormously important. That means there is no single magic constituency that can deliver the Senate seat. And El Sayed's primary coalition is going to be tested against that reality. His campaign successfully energized voters who wanted a more progressive direction, but the general election is much larger. The question becomes whether those voters can bring along people who weren't part of that movement. And that's why the old argument about electability is suddenly back. Not because progressive candidates cannot win. They obviously can. El Sayed just proved that. The question is whether the coalition that wins a primary can be expanded enough to win statewide. That's the real test. And then there's Mike Rogers. Republicans don't have to win this race simply by waiting for Democrats to make mistakes. Mike Rogers is a serious candidate with statewide political experience. And unlike the Democratic side, the Republican nomination did not produce another competitive ideological battle. Rogers moved forward as the Republican nominee. That gives Republicans something extremely valuable: time. They can focus on defining the general election. But here's the warning for Republicans. They should not assume that a Democratic nominee automatically equals a Republican victory. The polling doesn't support that. The latest averages show a race that is essentially tied. And Michigan has already demonstrated that it can produce unpredictable statewide outcomes. So if Republicans want this seat, Rogers still has to build a coalition. He has to persuade independents. He has to hold the Republican base. And he has to compete with Democrats in parts of the state where the GOP cannot simply rely on national partisan loyalty. This is not a free Senate seat. It's a genuine battleground. The bigger fight inside the Democratic Party. Now we get to the bigger story. The Michigan primary exposed a question Democrats are going to have to answer across the country. What does the Democratic Party want to become? There is clearly a growing progressive wing demanding major changes in economic policy, healthcare, foreign policy, and the party's relationship with its traditional institutions. But there are also Democrats who believe the party needs to reconnect with voters who don't identify with progressive politics. Michigan is almost the perfect laboratory for that debate, because both sides have something to point to. Progressives can say, "We won," and they're right. El Sayed defeated the establishment-backed candidate. That demonstrates real grassroots strength. But moderates can respond. Winning the primary is not the same as winning Michigan. And they're right, too. The general election electorate is larger and more diverse. That's why the next phase of this campaign will be so revealing. If El Sayed can broaden his appeal without abandoning the voters who powered his primary victory, Democrats may have discovered a new model. But if the campaign becomes primarily about ideological conflict, national party battles, and internal Democratic divisions, Republicans will have an opening, and Mike Rogers will try to exploit it. The most important voters may not be the ones making the most noise. There's another reason this race is fascinating. The loudest political voters aren't necessarily the voters who decide statewide elections. The most active primary voters tend to be highly engaged. They follow politics closely. They donate. They volunteer. They argue online. But general election voters are different. Many are less ideological. Some barely follow the campaign until the final weeks. And some will decide based on issues that have almost nothing to do with the arguments dominating political social media. Jobs, prices, healthcare, public safety, taxes, the economy, and whether they trust the candidate. That creates a major strategic challenge for both campaigns. El Sayed has to take the energy of his progressive coalition and translate it into a message that reaches voters outside that coalition. Rogers has to take Republican enthusiasm and turn it into enough support among independents and persuadable voters. And neither side can afford to assume that national politics will do all the work for them. This is why the race could get very ugly. Once a Senate race becomes this close, campaigns change. Every statement gets examined. Every controversial vote gets turned into an advertisement. Every weakness becomes a fundraising opportunity. And every group that can move a few percentage points suddenly becomes extremely important. For El Sayed, Republicans are likely to focus heavily on his progressive positions and attempt to portray him as too far outside the mainstream for Michigan. For El Sayed, the response will be to present himself as a populist focused on economic issues, while attacking Rogers and the broader Republican agenda. And that means voters are going to hear two very different stories about the same election. One side will say, this is a choice between Michigan and Washington. The other will say, this is a choice about the direction of the Democratic Party. And the winner will be the candidate who manages to make their version of the race the one voters actually believe. So where does that leave us? The Michigan Senate race is not proof that Democrats are collapsing, and it is not proof that Republicans are guaranteed to win. The data simply doesn't support either conclusion. What it does show is something much more interesting. Democratic voters chose a candidate who represents a significant shift in the party's coalition and priorities. Now that candidate has to take that coalition statewide. And the first general election numbers show just how difficult that could be. At the same time, Republicans have a real opportunity, but they have not secured the seat. The latest polling is essentially a toss-up. That means the next phase of this race could tell us far more about American politics than the primary itself. Because November will answer the question the primary couldn't. Can a candidate win the Democratic Party's future and still win the voters who aren't part of that future yet? That is what Michigan is about now. Not simply Abdul El Sayed versus Mike Rogers. Not simply progressive versus establishment. But a much bigger question about whether either party can build a coalition large enough to win in a deeply divided country. And with the Senate potentially hanging in the balance, Michigan could end up being one of the states that decides everything. So don't look at this race as a finished story. It isn't. The primary is over. The real election has just begun. And if the current polling is any indication, Michigan could be one of the closest Senate battles in America, all the way to Election Day. What do you think? Can Abdul El Sayed expand his coalition and hold Michigan for Democrats? Or does Mike Rogers have the advantage in a statewide race this close? Let me know your take in the comments. And if you want more fact-based breakdowns of the races that could decide control of Washington, make sure you're subscribed to 50 Post.